Richmond's news people, 8 News. Welcome to This Week in Richmond. With little more than 4 weeks left in the race for governor, which candidate is ahead and why? Republican Jim Gilmore continues to ride his promise to eliminate personal property taxes, while Democrat Don Beyer is crossing the state touting education and the environment as the keys to Virginia in the next century. Today, a reporter's roundtable on the 97 vote on This Week in Richmond. Now, here's your host, Lisa Schaffner.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. There are just 4 Sundays left before Virginians go to the polls to decide the political direction of the Commonwealth from here into the 21st century. About 3 months ago, we tapped the insights of those who are following the campaigns for governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. Today, we do so again. Welcoming today, again, one more time, Randy Davis. He's the political reporter for Virginia Capital Public Television. Thanks for being here, Randy. Okay. Also, we have with us back again to share his insights on the races, Tim Murtaugh. He is the Richmond-based political reporter for Charlottesville TV station WVIR. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Thanks.
And as always, our 8 News political reporter, do you know who he is? Richard Rial. Thanks for being here, Richard.
All my buddies are
I know.
out here.
You guys are all very well acquainted.
Get some pretzels.
And we need the table right here in front of us. Well, let's just start this off with what people are thinking out there. And I know that you all have the pulse of the voters out there. Do you think that they're a little more interested in the race, considering it's just right down the pike at this point? Tim, I'll start with you.
No.
No.
I don't think everyone, actually what everyone is talking about is how little interest voters seem to have.
Why is that this year?
It's not a very exciting race. It doesn't seem to a lot of people. There are the competing income, the car tax cut plans, right. And voters seem to think that issue is interesting. But by and large, they don't seem to have tuned into the race, even though we're just over a month away from Election Day. To borrow a line from Andrew Kane, who is another Capitol reporter for the Washington Times, he said, on the one hand, if you vote for Jim Gilmore, you've got an experienced politician who offers a tax cut and says education is a priority. On the other hand, you have Don Beyer, who's an experienced politician who offers a tax cut and says education is a priority. I think a lot of voters are confused as to really which is which.
Randy, you feeling pretty much the same?
I think so. And the strange thing to me is that the candidates themselves and their campaigns are coming out with news conferences every other day where they make announcements as if it's news. For example, the Black Legislative Caucus is coming out for Democrats. The people who support the anti-abortion groups are coming out for the Republicans. I mean, you know, there hasn't been any real, what I would call news, other than, I think, the FOP endorsement of Don Beyer. I think that's about the only thing that you would say wouldn't, in any campaign, just come right down the same lines.
Haven't they been, is your sense as well, they've been so careful. I mean, we've had so many cycles now of negative advertising, and everybody knows that negative advertising and negative campaigning, people don't like it. It works. And at this point, maybe it's a good idea for maybe Don Beyer to try it. Because right now, as we're looking 4 weeks out, relatively dead heat statistically, but it seems like Gilmore's driving the bus and maintaining the momentum, is he not?
Gilmore has done a pretty good job in leading the campaign, as in he seems to react more quickly than Don Beyer has to a lot of issues. The tax cut thing, Beyer was left for weeks to criticize Gilmore's, and then he came up with his own. So it does seem that Beyer is having to follow a lot of times, and I don't know that this is a race where we'll see a lot of personal negative ads, as we saw 3 years ago when Chuck Robb and Oliver North was really nasty personally. They will, I'm sure, run some ads that people could call negative, criticizing each other's records. But I don't think that there will be any ads attacking either one of them in their personal lives.
But the negative kind of started this week. They were bringing in Pat Robertson and trying to link. But that's as nasty as it's gotten so far. And just 4 weeks out, that's kind of surprising.
Yeah, that seems to make sense, though. I mean, that goes with the Democratic pattern of trying to link, especially Mark Earley of the Attorney General candidate for the Republicans and Jim Gilmore. Between the two of them, they've gotten $85,000 this time around, at least so far.
Linking the Republicans, or at least the Republican candidates this year, with extreme views of the party. And I think that's something we all knew at the beginning of the campaign would come out at one time or the other. The unusual thing to me is why the same thing is being tried again that was tried last year against John Warner, was tried during the last campaign against Allen and Gilmore, and didn't seem to do a whole lot. It looks like if they could find some other way to paint them as extremists rather than bringing Pat Robertson into it, Looks like they would.
It seems like this year is kind of interesting for politicians. It's a good case study in that, do you give the voters what they need in perhaps some more negative or controversial type advertising, or do you give them what they want, which means none, and they're not interested in the race at all? And this year it seems like the politicians have gone not giving that controversial, the negative ad campaign, but the voters aren't interested. They're not tuning in to the race and what's going on.
It may be that, or it may be that we're not far enough along yet. I mean, 4 weeks away from the election seems like a pretty short time. However, I think during the last 2 weeks of the election, they're going to pull out all the stops, especially if the two candidates remain as close as they are now in the polls. If one pulls out ahead of the other, they may back off some plans. But if they're tight up until the last couple of weeks, I think they're going to just let everything fly.
Let's give some unsolicited advice here. Let's start maybe with Don Beyer. Let's put him up on the grease rack and take a look under the hood and see what maybe needs to be done for his campaign. He's a personable guy. You meet him in person, and he's well liked, and he remembers everybody's name, and he's funny, and none of that's coming across in the campaign, is it?
No, that's probably the best thing that he had on hand going in. Is one of the things that we listed early on as one of Don's advantages was that he has is better at. He's a better backslapper, and hey, he's a how's it going kind of guy. Maybe for advice for Don, it may not be a correctable error at this point. A lot of people had said that if he had stuck to his original mantra of a tax cut is a bad idea, it's reckless, he could have done like Chuck Robb did in winning elections, saying, I'm keeping all my options open, I'm saying nothing about taxes. But when he reversed himself and said, you know, I've got a tax cut plan, but mine's better than Gilmore's, I'm not sure that is a correctable error.
In hindsight, how bad of an error was that?
I think that he really suffered a credibility loss for a lot of people when spending so much energy saying that this is a terrible idea, and then 2 months later saying, well, his idea is bad, I've got a better way to do the same thing.
So what's he need to do between now and the election?
On the tax issue, he really has to sell his own plan. He has to point by point make the case as to why his is good and Jim Gilmore's is reckless.
Is he not just falling into Jim Gilmore?
Yeah, I tend to disagree with that. I think the more he talks about the tax cut plan, the more Gilmore has the opportunity to bring his up and say, well, I was first, mine does more, this and so forth. I think what would help Beyer's campaign most is something he doesn't have much control over, and that is to have face-to-face debates with Gilmore. Gilmore has turned down just tons of debates, and Beyer has said, I'll be at every one of them. I think if you put the two candidates together, it goes back to what Tim was talking about. I think Beyer has a little bit more charisma, a little bit more of a personality that would really show during a face-to-face debate. I think the Gilmore people know that, which is why they're refusing the debates. Plus, they don't feel like they have anything to gain by agreeing to these debates. So there's not much of an opportunity for him to be contrasted with Gilmore as far as personality goes.
So does that not magnify what's going to go on tomorrow night between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock at Virginia Commonwealth University, the two on stage together?
On stage with Doug Wilder, even, which is another part. That's a part of the story
This
too.
may be the most interesting, the most important in a political campaign debate that we've seen in a long, long time, and it's got national and international interest with C-SPAN and the other networks saying that they want to carry it. Even Wilder being there, as you say, lends a lot to it. But there hasn't been really anything else except for the debate in West Virginia that was early in the campaign.
That nobody paid attention to, doesn't seem.
What role do you think Wilder's going to play in this? He's always a loose cannon out there.
Well, the important thing is to remember that this is his program. This is his radio program. And the TV stations will be carrying it as part of this program. So he's in charge of the whole thing. And he can take it any way he wants to. And Governor Wilder is a very good broadcaster. He's a very good communicator. And he's not going to let things just sit and control themselves. He's going to make sure that they really get into it.
I want to go back, since we've given Don Beyer some perhaps helpful hints on how to run his campaign for the next 4 weeks. Let's do the same for Jim Gilmore. What do you think that he needs to do? Randy?
Be careful. Don't step where you're not sure you're stepping. And I think the election at this point is his to lose. I think
even though the polls have him that close?
Yeah. I think earlier in the campaign it might have had something to do with what Governor Allen did or didn't do as his term winds down. But I think it's probably too late for him to do something now or say something that would mess up Gilmore's chances.
Gaffe.
Yeah. I think, though, that Gilmore still could, if he's not very careful, say something or do something that could sway some voters. And again, if it remains this tight, just a few voters, well, not a few, but I mean, statistically speaking, could make the difference.
There is an issue that may be sort of a wedge issue that hasn't really come up yet, and that's a perennial one of abortion. In an interview with the Times-Dispatch, Gilmore the other day said that he would sign a parental consent bill if it came across his desk, and that parental consent is different from the new parental notification law that we have. Parental consent would actually say that a minor girl would have to seek permission from a parent before getting an abortion. And Gilmore said that he would sign it if it came to him, but it wasn't one of his big priorities. Now, in a fundraising letter that he sent out to social conservatives, he says that he would fight for a parental consent law, which is maybe semantics, but others may read more into that. That may be an issue where Jim Gilmore is vulnerable if Don Beyer chooses to seize that. And I understand that the Beyer campaign has an abortion commercial in the can, and that the Gilmore campaign has an abortion response commercial already in the can. So I guess they're just waiting to see who will take the first shot.
Could be a possibility in the coming weeks. All right, much more for us to discuss with our guests on this Sunday afternoon as we talk about the 97 vote here in Virginia. But first, we head to a commercial break. Don't forget, if you have a message for us, here's how you can reach us by phone or by fax. We'll be right back. You're watching This Week in Richmond from Richmond's News People 8 News. Welcome back, everyone. On this Sunday afternoon, we'll continue our discussion focusing on the Virginia elections in just a moment. But first, a look ahead at another very busy week ahead here at 8 News. Now, tomorrow night, as we have already mentioned, Democrat Don Beyer and Republican Jim Gilmore make a very rare appearance in the very same place at the very same time at a debate over at VCU. Of course, we'll have the highlights of that. On Wednesday, a 14-year-old Hopewell boy is to be sentenced for abusing an 18-month-old by repeatedly dropping that toddler on his head. And the skies over Richmond will be very busy as the Richmond Air Show comes to town this week. We'll have all of those stories for you on 8 News at 6 and 8 News Tonight all this week. We hope that you can join us. Now, back here on the Sunday afternoon, we're talking about the upcoming election. November 4th is fast approaching. We're talking about the issues before we went to the commercial break. What do you think are some of the other issues, maybe in addition to the abortion issue, that will be coming up in the next 3.5 to 4 weeks?
Education polls say that education is the most important thing on the minds of the voters. Of course, and there's another school of thought that says that the voters who are answering these poll questions think that they're supposed to say education,
right, exactly.
So they do.
They're not giving the truth.
Right. You know, their eyes say tax cut, but their mouth says education. So education is a big one, and we've got vastly differing approaches on how to do this from the two guys who are running for governor. And Gilmore says that he wants to hire 4,000 more teachers, which would make for smaller classroom sizes, but that also create a demand for more classrooms. Don Beyer says that he'd like to spend $400 million on higher salaries for our existing teachers. But then that doesn't do very much to address classroom sizes. So they're coming at it from two different ways. I think so. Education will still be a big one.
Randy, anything?
I think the affirmative action issue is not dead. It seemed to die down a little bit after John Hager's explanation of why he said what he said on the radio debate or call-in program. But I think that's an issue that Democrats can go after to really divide some voters and to help some voters make up their minds, as penning the Republicans as the ones who are for getting rid of affirmative action when they say all they want to do is get rid of the quotas and the goal setting of affirmative action.
Staying on affirmative action for a moment, certainly one of the crucial, what is it, the last how many decades has it been that a Democrat has been able to win the governorship without getting more than 92% of Virginia's black vote? Very critical, very critical. It was critical for Doug Wilder, and it's going to be critical again this year. Jim Gilmore and the Republicans may have learned a few things between here and the last 4 years, because they are aggressively seeking the African American vote. They're not running candidates in places where there's a black Democrat running, hopefully not to split the vote there and get turnout. Where do you see that? You've been following that as well, Randy, where that stands now?
Well, again, going back to what we said earlier in the program, I don't think that it was any surprise that the black Democrats in the legislature came out for the Democrats. And I think that that most people who are going to vote one way or the other because of tradition, who are in the minority community, will presumably vote Democrat. I don't think that anybody could serve themselves well by taking that vote for granted, which is something that the Democrats always have to watch out for. But I don't really see that many black and white issues coming up, pardon the pun, during this this campaign.
Did Doug Wilder hurt Don Beyer a lot when several weeks ago he came out and said, hey, do not take the black vote for granted? And it seemed that Don Beyer took really the major hit on that.
Well, I don't know that it would hurt that much. It may have served as a wake-up call for the party to do just what he said, not take it for granted.
Everybody talked about it for a week, and then after that it was on to something else.
Right.
Well, as we were talking about why voters haven't paid attention too much, the whole week's worth of Doug Wilder stories in the campaign made, at least for some interesting politics, where in this race there really hadn't been much before. And Doug Wilder is nearly always interesting. So,
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah. The governor is at that.
But when we get back to what is the central theme of Jim Gilmore's campaign, and that is your wallet, that personal property tax, leave aside for a minute whether it will eliminate the property tax or not, which I think it's universally agreed by those who look into it, it won't.
right, it won't completely
do what
eliminate
it says
it,
it
no.
will do. Localities will be reimbursed by the state, and this is based on a lot of projections. But man, for everybody that shells out that money,
Yep.
that sounds good.
Got some good advice early on from someone that said this is a great issue because everyone hates, it's the most hated tax in the Commonwealth.
Even given the fact that it doesn't have a snowball's chance when it gets to the legislature as it's currently
The
constituted.
money committees in the General Assembly are pretty firm about saying that this tax cut, either Buyer's cut, which is an income tax credit, not a direct manipulation of the personal property tax, they say that there's no way either one of these plans is getting through intact. Maybe fragments of both have a chance to get through.
You talk about bridging the gap, though. That's an issue that blacks, whites, browns, yellows.
Everybody who has
you
to sit
name
down
them.
and write a check, and 90% of the cars in the Commonwealth do cost less than, or are valued at less than $20,000, which is the eventual threshold of the Gilmore plan. So this is an issue that affects an awful lot of people, millions of Virginians.
And the leaders of the Money Committee say now that there's no chance that this would pass. But I think if you look ahead to January and February, if they set up public hearings, and especially in the evenings when the average people can come down to the General Assembly and testify as to whether they would like their personal property taxes cut out or a tax credit, whichever one it is, they might have to bow a little bit to some pressure from the public. They haven't been heard face-to-face with the legislators on this issue.
They just may well hear about that on November 4th.
Yeah, definitely. Hey, we were talking about former Governor Doug Wilder, and of course a very high-profile politician that is avidly followed here in the metro area and across the state. He's really about the only person that has got into the race, and even at that he's been saying, I'm not going to get into the race, but I'm going to talk about the race, but not get into it. We haven't seen a lot from Allen. We haven't seen much from President Clinton helping Don Beyer out, and it seems to me that that's another area, that lack of enthusiasm on the average voter, because there's just not those high-profile names that have been involved in this race.
Especially, guys, there's only 2 races for governor in this
In the whole
entire country
country,
right
yeah.
now. This one and the one in New Jersey.
Well, George Allen has run a TV ad for Jim Gilmore,
But not a
and
lot. I mean,
it hasn't been. I don't know what size buy it was for a market saturation, but he has made appearances, and I expect that he'll do that again. But he hasn't had a heavy presence in this. Even though, I mean, there is something on the line for George Allen as well. He would like to get his man elected to succeed him, to polish his resume a little bit as he looks forward to whatever he's got in his sights down the road.
So if we leave Doug Wilder out of it, the election, as far as outside influences, could come down to the overwhelming popularity of George Allen compared to the overwhelming unpopularity of Pat Robertson. And having those two run against each other in the wings could influence some folks.
Don Beyer's got to make the difficult case that there needs to be a change in the governor's mansion, because some of the current governor, George Allen, some of his approval ratings are in the 70% range, which is astonishing. But they've had 4 years to get to not like the guy.
He's had 4 years to screw up.
That's a long time to maintain those popularity ratings, and they may be at a high for his term now. I'm not sure about that. And so Don has to make the case that a guy who is along the similar ideological lines of George Allen is not the way to go, when the current guy, who is very similar to Jim Gilmore in ideology, is wildly popular.
And I've got to step in here. I knew we'd get you guys talking here. We'll be back with more on the upcoming November election after these messages. You're watching This Week in Richmond from Richmond's News People 8 News. Welcome back, everyone, on this Sunday afternoon. We're talking about the 97 vote just a few weeks away, and we need to include the Attorney General's race and the Lieutenant Governor's race, which we have been negligent in talking about.
I've been thinking about it the whole time.
You've been thinking about it the whole time.
Laying awake
Like
at
most
night.
Virginia voters.
And I tell you what, that's very typical of Virginia voters. Not much attention, and I bet if you ask most people, they don't even know who the candidates are.
I'm sure of that.
Conventional
I
wisdom
know that.
right now that the AG's race is pretty close and that Payne may have a slight edge in the Lieutenant Governor's race. Is that the thinking?
Yeah, I think that is. I think that most people think that Mark Earley has an edge in the Attorney General's race, though that one is close too. The Lieutenant Governor's race, I don't know if people realize the job of Lieutenant Governor is really the least important of the three, even though it's second in the rundown there. But
Unless
this
something happens
time
to the
through, I
governor.
mean, the way the current setup of the General Assembly is, Lieutenant Governor is actually pretty important because it's 2020 in the Senate, and so the Lieutenant Governor gets to break ties I mean, it might happen a dozen times during a session, not terribly often, but the Democrats have always had control of the Senate, and most recently, just because they did have Don Beyer as Lieutenant Governor, he was the 21st vote a lot of times. The Lieutenant Governor's race makes a big difference as whether that 21st vote is a Republican or a Democrat. It really could change policy.
Especially if a Republican like Jim Gilmore takes the top spot.
That's right. If he has a governor of his own party who's going to sign legislation, that makes an enormous difference.
Randy, how are they doing in the Lieutenant Governor's race?
Well, I think the Lieutenant Governor's race, as Tim said, I think Mr. Payne has an edge now, if only because of his popularity. He has served as a congressman, and it may well end up being a split ticket because of that. I don't think it's any differences between their politics or their policies, but just because of the name recognition, if nothing major changes between now and November 4th. Another background side issue very few people talk about is that there is another election going on this year, and that's for the House of Delegates. And all of the viewers out there have a delegate that will be up for election or re-election or having somebody challenge them. And the balance of power in the House of Delegates may be a lot closer than some people think. But again, very little attention is being paid to those races.
Now, so far, I know that they've had a couple of Commonwealth polls out, and everything has indicated that everyone's just pretty darn close in the races. Is there another poll that's coming out between now and November 4th?
We've got a couple
We'll
scheduled
see.
We've got a
between here.
couple.
Mason-Dixon will do one, VCU will do one more.
Do you expect that those polls are going to stay pretty much the same? You see any?
Well, it's hard to. I haven't seen
I'd
anything.
spend my day out at Colonial Downs if I could do that.
Well, you know.
There hasn't been, like we've been talking about, there's no great supply of news in these campaigns, and so.
But I'm willing to go on a limb here and say that if the poll comes out and it's for your candidate, that candidate will say these polls are right on.
Right.
And if they're not for the candidate, then the only poll that counts is the one that's on election
That's no limb.
Well, we've got just under a minute here to talk about, so let us pull out that crystal ball, and what do you think? I'll let all three of you get in on this one. We should keep an eye as the average voter in the next 3 to 4 weeks before the election. Randy?
The type of commercials that are being run, they can tell you if they're strictly negative from one side, that candidate feels that he's in trouble.
On tomorrow night's debate, I think, is really big. If Don Beyer comes out swinging, really, I mean, throws a couple of really good punches at Jim Gilmore, I mean, it may indicate that he feels like that he's got to do the heavy lifting from here on in. I mean, it may be incumbent upon Don Beyer to come from behind and win this.
I think it's almost like any kind of heavyweight fighter. When you're taking on the champion, you've got to hit it. You've got to get a knockout. Gilmore right now may have be wearing that belt, and Don Beyer better come out with some haymakers, not just tomorrow, but between here and November 4th.
If you're interested now in the election, now's the time.
Now's a good time to tune in.
Yeah,
Sure.
now's a good time. Richard Rial, thank you as always. Tim Murtaugh, thank you as
Lisa.
well. And Randy Davis, thank you. It's great. Great insight. We'll have you back
Well,
after the election and see
yeah,
how close to reality
we'll
you
match it
were.
up there. That's good.
And that's going to do it for us on this Sunday edition of This Week in Richmond. Again, we'd like to remind you that tomorrow is the last day to register if you plan on voting in next month's election. We urge you to do that. We'd also like to thank our guests, of course, again for joining us, and hope you have a terrific week ahead. Stay tuned. We'll see you back here next Sunday for another edition of This Week in Richmond.